We did have the question raised on the break of the firewall and Judicial Council's rulings that really have heightened the tension between board and cabinets, bishops and cabinets, and it is there. One suggestion is let's do away with Judicial Council, but that's out of our control too. But the other way to handle this is to have a frank discussion, and it seems to me that the Judicial Council rulings on the firewall are all surrounding fair practice. And if the fair practice initiatives are in place during any kind of CRC exiting or any kind of evaluation of the ordination of a person, then the firewall should be in place. But everything else, I don't see a ruling by Judicial Council or in the discipline on the interaction between boards and bishops and cabinets. Now, it deserves a further discussion. The suggestion from the staff, and that's why we have a great staff, is that we confine that discussion to our affinity group when the board chairs and the bishops and cabinets are together this afternoon. That'll be a concentrated time for you to have exact discussions about that. And it really is confined to those leaders, by the way, in terms of the issue. So that's one suggestion. I would have liked to have opened this up, but the staff said, no, let's go with our agenda. And so that's one area. The other area is Thursday afternoon, annual conferences will again have chances to gather. So this is other venues that they have planned for us to deal with this, okay? So let's tackle this final area, which is clergy effectiveness and the whole area. And I thought I'd share some leadership traits of clergy that I found in my research. And this is, my dissertation was on high effective clergy. And I apologize, I had to take out all of the heavy academic statistics that we were involved in this particular one. It was boring me. If it bored the presenter, you'd be falling asleep. So I'd fall asleep during the presentation if it was full too. But if you're interested, I could send you a copy of the dissertation if you need it, if you want all the hard facts. But here's my observation. Some United Methodist clergy seem to be able to grow a local church no matter what the conditions of the church, the demographics, or the previous leadership of the church. And the question is why? That I've just noticed throughout my career that there are some of you who have this gift, so to speak. Wherever we place you, you can bring vitality. And that was my problem. My question was, what was it? What were the traits, the qualities, or characteristics, if any, of these high effective and successful United Methodist Church ministers that enable them to grow and vitalize wherever they're sent? So we did both a quantitative and a qualitative study on this, and the quantitative results were very clear. Basically had two focus groups, high effective clergy and low effective clergy, and we just gave them assessments. And on the assessment of the emotional intelligence, the BOM is what I used, there was a significant correlation at the 05 level, it was even higher than that, by the way, in total EQ, or emotional intelligence score, between high effective and low effective clergy. So it's without a doubt, I think we've proven that emotional intelligence is one of the keys in successful ministry. The other ones that we had were the BOM has 20 scales, and these clergy high effective were significant on 15 of the 20, and their overall score was that. There was also a correlation between the church size and vitality of their present appointment, between high and low. Duh, that's kind of a no-brainer. But the other one was there a correlation in the self-ranking of our clergy, high and low effective. In other words, the high effective ones did believe that they were more effective, and the low ones had lower self-esteem when it came to their self-assessment of who they were. But basically, there were 12 key results. I did also a quantitative study of in-depth interviews with high effective clergy, and it was clear that in emotional intelligence, they were clearly light years ahead of the low effective group. And really, emotional intelligence is divided up into a great many ways to do this. We're going to rush through this. You can access this through any of the major works on emotional intelligence, but this particular matrix has personal competence, both what I see, my internal self, and what I do, my external actions. So emotional intelligence is really good at monitoring who I am and what my internal leadership capacities are, and then how I display that or how I show up, basically, in performance. And then the second one is social competence, which is also an awareness of how others, how I relate and see other people in EQ, as well as how I manage those relationships. And again, we're going to speed through this because it's all there, and you could go back to this. I'll make this PowerPoint available also. But I'm always struck by the tremendous sort of comprehensiveness of emotional intelligence. In self-awareness, just one of the quadrants, it is emotional self-awareness, accurate self, it's all of these things. But when the Harvard Business Advisory Board was polled on what was the #1 ranked quality of high effective leaders in a secular world, they ranked self-awareness as the #1 trait that they're looking for, or what has they've seen as a successful quality, self-awareness. Again, to speed through these are the ones with self-management, and I'm always struck by the emotional self-control. Many of our clergy who really have trouble where they are have the lack of filters, and these lack of, yeah, I know you know, the lack of these emotional filters really do them in, because they really just don't know how to manage them. And it's constantly getting them into trouble in some ways. But you have other things like adaptability and achievement, optimism. These are things that you normally wouldn't relate to emotional intelligence, but it's all there. The third one, social awareness, empathy, organizational awareness. You know not only about how individuals act, you know how systems operate in emotional intelligence. And empathy is an interesting one because on the Baron test, the high and low effective clergy did not have a significant difference on this particular dimension. Interesting enough. So the low effective clergy, they were clearly lower, but not at the 05 level. They were able to learn. And I think this comes back to our seminary training, where we have emphasized pastoral care and counseling and CPE. You can get better on any of these. You can work on any of these traits in order to improve. And what we have to improve our clergy on is all of them, like emotional self-awareness and getting better filters. I think if we work with them, we can improve them in emotional intelligence overall. And this was sort of the takeaway from the dissertation research. And the last one is relationship management, and these are, I love these because there's so much qualities of what we're seeing in secular leadership also. Inspirational leadership, influence, change, catalyst, conflict management, which comes with change automatically. But inspirational leadership is what I'm hawking now as the quick sort of reality that we all have to deal with. Some of you might have caught President Obama's, after he was reelected, he was asked in an interview, what would he do differently in his first term? And Obama's response is, more inspiration and less perspiration. He really said he had failed to inspire. And I think that that was a good self-awareness, because I think that that's what's plagued him. And I think that it's an example for us that inspirational change is the greatest lever that we have as influencers. So I had an entrepreneur professor who said the language of leadership is this, that the language of managers is data and information. And some of your DSs know that this is a reality that you have to deal with. The language of coaches is questions, and especially provocative questions. And the language of leaders is inspiration, especially narrative inspiration. So the telling of inspirational stories to motivate and to spur people. That's a gift that I think we need to impart upon our clergy. Part of their task or their central key in leadership is to inspire others to greater heights. You're all familiar probably with the Johari window, and we don't have time to go into this directly, but what I really think is important in the Johari window is the third quadrant in the top left-hand corner, the blind self, where we don't know about this quality in us, but others know it and see it. And it's really a blind spot because we're not aware of that. Now, let me give you the example. I had a clergy person who was very gifted towards the nearest end of his career, but he came from military chaplaincy, of which he was high command in military, and he had a hard time making the switch to the local level, even though he's very gifted. And he was convinced he was a collaborative, distributive leader. I mean, he was absolutely convinced he did that. His church, his superintendent, his evaluations are, this is a command and control leader that really is directive. And when we showed him the result, he just couldn't believe it. And the harder thing was he didn't accept it, okay? It was the blind self, even when the evidence was all there, that did him in. Because he was convinced, he had read the literature, he convinced he was a collaborative leader, but clearly he wasn't showing up that way. And I think that blind self is really the one that we've really got to pay serious attention to with some of our clergy. Now, I'm going to speed through this because I found 12 sort of keys, of which emotional intelligence is one on a quantitative one. Also, high effective clergy excel in transformational leadership, and I don't have time to really delve into the fullness of that, maybe another time, but it is demonstrated in their commitment to empower laity. All of the high effective leaders that I interviewed, their main objective was to empower laity and get out of the way. So the paradigm that we lifted in the research was they see the gift in others, they name and cultivate those gifts, and they unleash these gifts and people into ministry and community. That was the paradigm that was sort of we gleaned out of their work. And this is what we've got to get back. I am convinced that the one thing we must jettison in our United Methodist Church is the individualistic solo practitioner in ministry. We send you out and you sink and swim on your own, even though we're trying to put support systems in place. That's not the Jesus way. The Jesus way is communal. It is to send people in resourcing together out. And we've got to find our way for the solo practitioner that becomes the hero status, by the way. In other words, we're reinforcing competition and directiveness, and we've got to find a way to collaborate in our ministry and not send the young clergy that we have coming in to sink or swim on their own, especially in these difficult rural or turnaround assignments. I think assigning them a coach, as I recommend in the book, a coach, a spiritual director, a counselor, it would be worth the money for the church to undergird their ministry, especially in the beginning, with all the resources we can to get them so they're not alone in solo practicing. All right, so again, I can go on, and I'm on a soapbox, and I apologize for that, but I really think we've got the paradigm wrong. Perfect example of this is when I was a district superintendent in Los Angeles, the high effective clergy with a large church was going to do a fundraiser for Katrina right after the hurricanes hit. And they thought they'd throw a concert because they're very musical in the church. And they thought, if we could raise $5,000, it'd be great. Well, she put the idea out. And there was a guy in the church who had only come for about a year, just came to worship, said he was very busy on the road a lot, couldn't get involved. And he said, maybe I could help you with this concert. Well, it turned out he was a music promoter in the industry. He got Katie Lang, Jackson Brown, all gratis, all these big headliners to come to the church. He set up all the roadies, all the tech stuff by volunteers. He then went out and he got money from the radio stations and others to pay for all the tickets. The church did not have to pay for a cent. He set everything up. They had the concert on Sunday, of which I got a front row seat. Sometimes being a DS really helps. we had worship in the morning, by the way, and it was just, normal worship. It was not packed. That afternoon, the concert took place. They lined up about 3 hours ahead of the concert. The line went around this massive church for blocks. They've never seen this many people. They filled every spot in that church, and they raised something like, at the end of the day, almost $100,000 from this one event. All from one layperson that was anonymous to that time and just came by accident and said, I think I could help you out here. Empowerment of our laity is the key. All right, next one is all of them possessed a deep well of faith. And this well affected all of the key issues around leadership: vision, humility, resilience, passion. The faith is what fueled these leaders. And this is a one-up we have from the secular community, because they don't often access this huge dimension for us, which is our fuel and our passion and our directives in life come from God. And we could just share this straight out. And when I'm in secular venues, by the way, which often you find yourself in those and you get a chance to speak, the secular folks, because I'm a minister, it's okay for me to talk about faith. And they really want to talk about that faith, but they're not allowed in their organization perhaps to do that. But time and time again, I'm called upon for the faith component in secular gatherings of leaders or CEOs or whoever you have that you're dealing with. This interest is just remarkable to me. The other interest that I'm finding in secular venues is the sense of community. Is so, there's a thirst for community, even in their organizations. We have the advantage of being able to talk about this and to access these deep wells directly as part of who we are and our relationship to God. So we need to use this. Along with this is a tremendous sense of passion. There's an engagement and focus in their work, and it's because of this deep well of faith, by the way. I saw a deep sense of humility about these leaders. And it's interesting because some of the leaders said that they were deeply humble and stuff, but they didn't act that way. So once again, it was this blind spot of speaking the words and saying it on paper, but for the dissertation purposes, I didn't remark that in my findings. But it is to be consistent. If you speak about humbleness, then you got to act humble. Again, how you show up. All had mentors who shaped their formation and leadership in ministry, and they had mentors throughout their entire career. Some of them were near the end, near retirement, and they still had mentors who they met with regularly. Interesting thing is, none of them had official coaches in their ministry at this particular time. They have used coaches in the past, but at this particular time of the research, they did not have a coach, which I found interesting because the paradigm of coaching is so popular now. I bet you with this new generation, maybe coaches will be more prominent, but mentors are critical. And mentor-coach is probably going to be the critical paradigm that we're looking at in the future. They all demonstrated an entrepreneurial trait and behavior. And some had problems with this word entrepreneurial when I raised it. They said, oh, that's a word of the world. And I don't want to engage that. But then when I explained to them my operational definition was immediately seizing on opportunities and avoiding hazards like the plague, they said, yeah, I do that. I mean, they really practice it even though the word was not something they all resonated with. But all of them were entrepreneurial in their core. And the interesting thing was the difference between the high effective and low effective is they immediately seized upon it. Others thought about it, but then they didn't do anything about it, and the opportunity passed very quickly. These folks immediately made the contacts and followed up on the action steps to get the opportunity going. They excelled, of course, in oral and written communication, that's a no-brainer. And they demonstrated a resiliency in their personal ministries. They all had stories about when they failed, and failed badly, and how they were able to use faith as a vehicle to move them forward and really learn from the failure. So as a corollary to this, the question of mentors and resiliency, there was a glass ceiling. All of the women, which are about 40% of the study, of my study, mentioned sexism in their ministry, and dealing with sexism both in a systemic as well as individual way. So it is very clear that sexism is alive and well in our church, and we've got to continue to address this and attack it at whatever levels we encounter it from. And I'm glad to say that we lead the way in our other faith communities in terms of empowerment of women, but we have a ways to go. We all have a ways to go on that one. They also had a personal vision, and that personal vision affected their larger vision of where the church was. Now, interestingly enough, their personal vision wasn't supplanted into the church's vision. They clearly worked with the church for their own vision, but they were able to navigate their personal vision within the sort of structure of where the church needed to go. So there wasn't this sense of intrusion of personal vision into the organization's vision. And they all understood systems theory. Most of them read Harvard Business Review and were up on the latest leadership literature. I found that very striking also. As a corollary to that, the dynamic relationship between faith and leadership development is that they excelled in both spiritual practices, the foundation and well of faith, as well as leadership practices. And what I found is that these two form a synergy for regular practices. So when they showed up, their internal selves had this well of faith as well as an understanding of organizations and leaderships and where they needed to go. So in faith development alone, we know that people are tremendously spiritual but have no clue about organization structures. I don't think they're as effective. Or we have those that are on the edge of leadership development. Faith is kind of shallow. That's not good enough. So both of these seem necessary for high effective leaders as traits. And finally, the situation and context does matter. Where we place people, the demographics, the history, the past leadership, location, all made a difference. And it made a difference not necessarily in vitality, but in sheer numbers. In other words, some of these high effective clergy were able to make huge leaps of worship attendance. That's what we mainly judged on. And it was because their demographics were favorable. Others were making small leaps, and the demographics were a factor in how they were able to be effective. They all grew, but some were not as dramatic as others. And so we realized that the quality of clergy leadership to adapt to the context makes a huge difference in the ultimate success of the local setting or the church itself. All right? So those are a quick way. I know we went too fast with this. We will post these, by the way. But I want to talk a little bit, finally, to wrap this up, about the limitations with competencies. Because if we focus just on competencies, we're sort of in trouble, because competencies are always time and culture bound. And we're struggling with this because we have competencies now on some of your plates that are no longer relevant to the church that we serve. Everything's changed with competencies. Though the general rule of thumb in the literature is that it takes about 10,000 hours to master something. So you start with concentrated, what they call deliberative practice or exercises. And it takes about 5 hours of concentrated focus and practice over a 10-year period to develop a mastery of any particular subject. The problem with it is this analogy and research is narrowed to a single discipline or context. For example, chess masters. There's a board and there's chess pieces, and they move in specific ways, but that's it. It has a boundary of the board and the complexity of the movement. Now, it's much deeper than that, but you master one context or boundary. And what we're dealing with is the complexity of the mastery of ministry, which doesn't have a boundary. So I'm struck by Rick Deshawn, who we use in the higher ed research, and some of you are participating in some of his study, who, as a secular researcher, said, I've never seen a job with such fast-paced and varied responsibilities, that he said, we pastors have to go from role to role on an instantaneous basis and be constantly shifting. So he called this multitasking and polychronic orientation, which is a researcher's term to say we're constantly having to change and adapt to whatever role that is called upon us. And we live this daily. I mean, it's schizophrenic for new people. It's schizophrenic for a researcher like Rick to see this. But for us, it's like, oh yeah, we're schizophrenic. That's part of who we are. And we live with that. And you that do it well are able to manage it and instantaneously move. So the mastery involves something more, because how many of us have put 10,000 hours exclusively on all the roles of ministry? Preaching, counseling, teaching, evangelism. You don't put that much time into any one aspect of what's required of us in the old paradigm. But what I have found, it's not the individual mastery of some of those. Some of you have done that, by the way. You've either studied that or you've gained that, and that's your great strength. But how none of us are able to master every facet of general ministry. It is this integration of the roles, though, that produces the seamless interaction of leadership. The interaction, putting it all together, that these high effective leaders had. And I do want to access one more issue that is not in the dissertation, but I've later come to realize, and that is the truly great leaders have both originality and innovation in their sort of repertoire. High effective clergy who continue to grow and vitalize churches combine mastery and originality as the foundation of their success. They're lifelong learners who continue to master whatever, and they never stop trying to learn about anything. But they're also originators, innovators, experimenters. One without the other will not succeed. And we have to continue to find novel ways even as we seek our mastery. So this particular group is a perfect example. There are probably some masters of ministry. Most of you are there. Some of you are getting there sitting at these tables. And it is fostering the balance between trying to master our craft of ministry, but always remaining on that cutting edge of originality, innovation, and experimentation. So Roger Martin is the secular business guy who just retired from Toronto School of Business that really has written a great deal on this, called The Opposable Mind is his major work on this area. And he reminds us that the great ones do both of these things. They deepen their mastery while continuing their originality. And I like the last line of this. They keep the proverbial trains running, but will never invent the future if you only stop at mastery. And are we keeping the proverbial trains running as masters, but not then taking the next step of the experimentation and innovation that the church has to have as we're in this transition period? Amy Edmondson, writer of Harvard Business Review, often says, and let me read this because it's so helpful, our natural tendencies, the way we are hardwired, will lead us to favor mastery over originality, will lead us to keep going in the direction we are going and try to improve marginally around the edges on what we've already done. In so doing, we utterly miss opportunities to make a big difference, something brand new and exciting. So I think that that's really true, that we can go into our silo of mastery and become really an individual expert in ministry. But what we're lacking then is what we need right now, which is what's the turn that's going to enable this whole church, the Church of Jesus Christ in the United Methodist context, to really be some dynamic presence in making disciples and transforming the world. It's here in this room, and we just got to find that. So the innovation diagram is if the goal is too large. If we do try to end world hunger, where do you start? Well, it needs collaborative impact. But if the goal is too small, file today's paperwork, it's not worth it. It's a question of relevancy. And what we've got to find is that sweet spot in between these two, the relevant and the impactful, that's really going to make a difference. And I'm counting on all of you to be part of that in your work and for the work of the Church of Jesus Christ. It's more than just us that's at stake here. So let me advocate one last thing, and that is bootlegging time. 3M pioneered this concept, and Google and many others are using it, where 20% of the working time of any researcher, or oftentimes any director, can be spent on any topic of passion or interest that they have. So it's their own time that they're paid for to find these things out. But it's structured accountability. There are some rules. You can't just go off on your own and say, I'm going to research this subject and really look into it. You've got to report it. You've got to meet with other collaborators who will expand upon your ideas and take you in a new direction. And you need to cross-pollinate with others in other areas of the company, such as the engineers get together with the human relation folks, the R&D gets together with marketing. And it's in that cross-pollination that the greatest innovations are starting to come out. So we need to take seriously how we're going to do this. One is you all need 20% of your working time in this originality and innovation. And as a bishop, I give you permission, if you're in my area, to take the 20%. I can't say that for every area, so you got to go back to your own leadership and do that. But I think my colleagues would really support this, that really give you permission to start thinking and researching and following your passions about originality. And then I just want to get one, it's like, how do we put in all this? One final takeaway of things that we're currently learning. We're starting a Toole Center of Leadership after Bishop Jack Toole and Marjorie Toole. And this is one thing that we're learning in our research. And it's really from the positive deviance research. Richard Pascal is the main guy on this area. It's easier to act your way into a new way of thinking than to think your way into a new way of acting. Now, this is really important for us because our old paradigm has focused on clergy education and feeding their minds only, and not holding them accountable to the practice. And this focuses on practice rather than knowledge in order to really leverage change of any organization. So the positive deviance is to look for what really works, find out and train people in what works, and then set them loose. The old paradigm of us gathering people for ministry immersions, presentations by people like me and others who will kind of feed your mind, and then sending them out, just not working. And I have a colleague at Pepperdine who's he's a Boeing high exec, and he was with their state-of-the-art research center. It was a executive center that Boeing built. Now, they were so embarrassed by his results, he couldn't use Boeing name in the dissertation, by the way. So he says a major aerospace company in his dissertation. He found out that this state-of-the-art executive center really didn't help anybody. They'd bring in Collins and Heifetz and all these high name, and people would get all jazzed up, and then they'd go back, and within about a month, they'd go back to their regular practices and nothing changed. And within 6 months, made absolutely no difference. So this is what I'm talking about, the paradigm that we're even struggling with in the secular world on this issue. Feeding people's minds does not make them change, does not make them show up any differently, is what we're finding. And so what I think is important for us now to think about is to couple this focus on behaviors, practices, with a performance coach who holds the person accountable, and this is proving to be much more successful in our work. So you have accountability and you have practice, and if you want to read on habits, which Duhigg on habit, is the latest book, but there's a whole bunch of literature around how you make things habitual. Might be the key to us having our rank and file becoming more effective. All right? All right. Now, let me take a quick look at where we are. We only have about 12 minutes for you to engage these questions, but at least we'll start. And we do have time for you to pick these up. So we're going to try to end about 10:50, and I apologize for trying to get so much in and really doing against what I preached on and making you practice more than you think. But here are the questions for you to, again, delve into. Don't worry about these guiding you, but you also can go back to your present discussions. But we'll try to wrap up about 10:50, and then the staff will give you some directions before lunch. And I'm going to be here till tomorrow. I head off to School of Congregational Development to do another one of those dog and pony things. But if you need to catch me, I'm around, love to interact with you, and we'll have concentrated time in focus groups to continue this discussion. So thank you so much, and why don't we try to wrap up with some discussion within your group. Okay, thank you.